This lecture covers the Victorian period, introduction, content, about 25 pages in our textbook from page 533 through 557. The content in the textbook paired with this lecture will cover your quiz, your second quiz in Blackboard. So I'm covering everything in the textbook. As long as you read that chapter, you'll have the information that you need for the quiz. The quiz questions will come straight from the book, but this might give you some additional insight or just an explanation if you need it. I might have to break this lecture into 2 different recordings. I'm using a new software, and I think I only get 15 minutes at a time, and if you haven't noticed, I am long-winded, so I'm going to get started. I'm sort of just kind of working through the chapter content in chronological order, and the first question that we kind of have to cover is what defines the Victorian period. So in the Romantic period, we had a different type of definition, but now we're getting back to something that I think is a little bit more traditional in terms of, well, what exactly is the Victorian period. Although I am certain that different historical critics, historical scholars, literary critics have varying definitions, extended definitions even, of the Victorian period. For, I guess, so to speak, all intents and purposes, Queen Victoria's reign is the Victorian period from 1837 to 1901. Now, some people might argue that the Victorian period extended on a little bit further, just based on the maybe like economic status of England, possibly even sort of the mindset of the people. But right after the turn of the century, the Victorian period technically ends, and that is, again, because of Queen Victoria's reign. The Victorian period, I feel like, is also defined by these very quick advancements in industrialization. So we're at a time where the steam engine is full steam ahead, pun totally intended. There are trains and train tracks, and it's all over the place, and it's booming. And so because of this, people can get from one city to another really quickly. This is also going to increase the opportunity for trade. It's going to increase the opportunity for people, in this case, if we're focusing on writers, to have new cultural experiences then to bring home, to write about and share with others. And so I think that the Victorians are getting a really bigger worldview, and we're going to see that in a really cool way here in a couple of slides. Some qualities might even, again, if we go beyond just the traditional definition of the Victorian period and Queen Victoria's reign, I think that there are some qualities that might even help define the Victorian period. This concept of earnestness, of being genuine and honest, and our textbook talks about that in a couple of ways. Moral responsibility, and you're going to see that, I think, in a lot of the writings from women who are feeling a sense of, we need to protect other more marginalized people, children being probably the most honest version of that. And then we have a very questionable feeling, of uncivilized individuals. We need to have our moral duty is to them as well. And that gets into a sort of a question, like, should we think that the way we live is how everyone needs to live? But our textbook alludes to that very briefly toward the middle to the end of the chapter when it talks about the white man's burden, but it really doesn't hit very heavily on that. And I think it's just a concept of okay, if we feel moral responsibility, we feel that based on our own set of morals, or however we're defining what it means to be moral. But is it fair for us to go into other cultures, other countries, and make their morals our morals? That's, I think, the question that our textbook seems to drop on and hope but doesn't really talk too much about. Also, quality, domestic propriety, really just kind of saying, here is what is considered to be the most modest, correct, respectful way, and we need to uphold it, particularly with women. I mean, we're going to read, not this week, but next week, part of a text that is characteristic in defining the impression that even men and women had of women's roles during the Victorian period. You know, you're going to notice that there's some progress, but not much still. Women still are seen as the angels in the house. They're seen as, the perfect hostess, the one who raises the children. She's calm and polite, and she doesn't have too many feelings, especially if they're negative. So what comes after the Victorian period? So writers after the Victorian period strongly tried to kind of differentiate themselves from it. You have these Victorian writers, and then immediately following it, people saying, we didn't like the Victorians, we don't want to be like the Victorians. Even unlike the Romantic period, where the writers of the time did not define themselves as Romantic writers, unlike that, during the Victorian period, our authors recognize their status as Victorian writers. And then the other thing that I want to say, kind of with thinking about qualities in particular, a lot of people, and I'll say this in another video, a lot of people associate the Victorians as being prudish and old-fashioned, but that's just not really the case. In fact, we really get a lot of discussion on sex work in the Victorian period. So, maybe there are slightly more conservative viewpoints that disagree with that. Of course, certainly there are during this time. But there's a discussion of it. It's not like they're sweeping it under the rug. So it's very interesting there. Now, our textbook breaks this up into different periods, and I'm going to work through that in 3 separate slides, and then tack on 2 more at the end. So first we have the early period, and that goes from 1830 through 1848. Again, we have this first steam-powered train right around 1830. It's going to open up in Liverpool and Manchester Railway. You're talking about bringing people from outside in, taking people from inside out, and that is probably one of the culminating events that's going to lead to the opportunity for so much progress throughout the Victorian period, cultural progress, social progress, technological advancements and things like that. But we also had some other advancements, such as Reformation. So a reform parliament was formed to reevaluate the electoral system, because what was happening is they had towns, and I don't know if towns is exactly the right word. However, there were places where Parliament had a representative, but there was no one living there. So these people were representing no group of people, but there was a representation or a representative for them. And yet there were other places, like very lower or lower middle class people, had no representation in Parliament. So this Reform Parliament, the Reform Bill of 1832, is really trying to give voting rights and representation opportunities for people who didn't have them, and to kind of even out the playing field. It's not going to go all the way, but there's a push toward that. And as you'll see toward kind of like the middle to end of this period, not the early period, the Victorian period, the middle class is growing, and they need a voice, and they demand a voice, and our writers demand a voice for them or for themselves. The need for reform is really clear at this point. I mean, now I'm speaking from obviously a very contemporary mindset, so to read about some of the terrible things that were still happening in the Victorian period, it's like, duh, can you guys get on board with change and progress? So I guess to say was clear, well, that's my 21st century viewpoint. But we still had, we talked about this in our last big lecture on the Romantic period, that the philosophy was that unregulated working conditions, unregulated capitalism will just kind of work itself out. So if someone's willing to work in this condition, then it's fine to pay them, if they're going to work for 5 cents all day and they agree to it, then it's not a problem. So there was still this viewpoint, but it was clearly controversial, clearly, again, I say that with a grain of salt, clearly problematic in that if they had to work, they had to work, and if that's all they could get, that's all they could get. So there was need for reform there, and our texts are going to certainly play on that. There was the corn law. Basically, it made either the food bread really a staple, so expensive that low-class people could not afford it, or you just couldn't even find it because of the taxes. And then again, the reform was clear. People needed to be represented in Parliament. So the mid-Victorian period and the late Victorian period, probably like my two favorite segments of the Victorian period. And there's a push toward progress, and it happens in the middle of the Victorian period. And part of that progress, again, relates to sort of like this bringing together of different cultures. It's inherently tied to the steam engine and the ability for things to travel, for people to travel. But during this time in Hyde Park, which is a very popular park in London, there's the Great Exhibition. They build a crystal palace. It is like a giant structure, very large structure, basically made of glass. So imagine a house, but bigger than a house, like a warehouse, a huge building, a factory-size building, built with glass and metal, done so that it is beautiful, but also using really fragile products as the main structure. And it's clear, it's reflective. You could analyze just the architecture of it if you wanted to. And inside of it, they bring in all of these exhibitions from all over the world, and people could buy a ticket and they could come and eat lunch on the lawn at the park and then walk through the Great Exhibition, the Crystal Palace. They could purchase things. There were little magazines and like guidebooks that accompanied going to the Crystal Palace and getting purchasing something or ordering it. And this is sort of what leads us to the development of our modern day department store, where we can go in, take in everything that we want to see, and then order or purchase what we would like. So not only is it almost museum-like in the sense of you can just walk through and see culture, or what culture you could see, but it was also a representation of you can buy whatever you want if you have the money and the means to get it. So the Crystal Palace is a really cool place, and people write about it, and I think it's one of sort of those culminating exhibitions that we see reflected in other places. Later on, I believe, I could be wrong about this, but I feel like I remember this correctly. There's something really similar in Chicago. I think it was called the World's Fair, and I believe it is after this time. So it's a really, really cool thing. I'm gonna pause here, jump into the next lecture, and I will continue this slide.